are you all doing? Welcome back to the Gospel Insights YouTube channel. Today we're going to be diving back into the basics of Christian belief by Joshua Strahan. Today we're going to be talking about the brief synopsis or summary of the Old Testament, the key events, the key points, and the key details within the Old Testament. So we won't be covering everything. I will be making videos later on the channel diving into every book and every character within the Old Testament. But for now, as we are laying down the foundation of the Christian faith, we're just giving a brief synopsis of what the Old Testament is. So if you haven't already, go follow the link in the description that leads to Amazon, Joshua Strahan's book, The Basics of Christian Belief. And without any further ado, let's go ahead and dive on in. Stay tuned. All right, how are y'all doing? Today I'm going to be showing you my presentation on the Old Testament. All right, so this is a brief synopsis of the Old Testament. This isn't every single detail, every character. We will be getting into that much later on, but it's important to understand first and foremost that the Old Testament is indeed history. It is not a mythological book. It is not just made up stories, old folks' tales, passed by oral tradition. This is real history, okay? So to know what Christianity is, we need to start with the Christian story. In the same way that we don't know people until we know their stories, where they've been and what they've been through, we can't really know the Christian faith until we know what the Christian story actually is. And this story goes all the way back to the very beginning. Technically, before there was even a beginning, there was just God, right? So in the very beginning, the book of Genesis starts with telling the creation story. There's the eternal being known as God, the great I am. And he creates the entire universe in just 6 whole days by speaking everything into existence. He praises everything that he's created and everything that he's made. And he even goes on to say that everything that he did make is good. He praises all of his creation and calls all of it good. Humans are made in his image and in his likeness. He rests on the 7th day. So he makes creation in 6 whole days, and he rests on the 7th day after making everything. The Genesis account, which is very important, recognizes monotheism, that there's only one God. He's the creator of everything, and he's the author and the celestial king of everything. So this is contrary to the popular theme at the time that Genesis was written, because there were a whole many other religions, and they all taught polytheism. Polytheism obviously means that there's multiple gods. In Genesis, God simply speaks the cosmos into existence in order to declare everything as being good, right? So other creation accounts, the worlds are formed through violence, through war, and through tragedy. For example, the Enuma Elish claims that there is the bloody remains of a god that ended up being the foundation for all of creation to happen in another religion. Also in Genesis, humans have inherent value and dignity. They bear the image of God and are tasked with caring for all of what God has created. However, in contrast, in both the Atrahasis, I don't know how to pronounce that, but the Atrahasis, which is another creation account, it's another creation story, which follows along with the Enuma Elish, as I listed earlier. Humans lack dignity and are rather, they're servants of the gods, they're slaves to the gods. They have to do their tasks and their work, and even providing the gods food, because gods in other religions and in other faith-based foundations, the gods have to eat. They actually have to provide themselves with food. Okay, so in Genesis, we see that there is a fall of mankind listed in Genesis chapter 3. So the biblical story starts off all good, but then things turn up going bad for the worse. The book starts with the first 2 humans, who are Adam and Eve, inhabiting a place called the Garden of Eden. This place is quite literally paradise, because heaven and earth overlap in this specific place, in this specific garden. There's two trees that are very, very important to note. You have the tree called the tree of life, and then the tree which is called the knowledge of good and evil. God permitted them from eating the tree of life, because if they eat this tree, then the fruit will make them live forever. But if they eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, then they will end up recognizing what good and evil is fully, and they will have willfully disobeyed God. God said that they would die if they eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It's never fully specified why eating that fruit is completely forbidden. Most biblical scholars would obviously agree that this is a test from God, but this test is not to set Adam and Eve up for failure. This test is not meant to set them up for failure. It's actually meant to set them up for success. In order to trust someone, trust must be earned. So even though God is fully trustworthy, he demonstrated that he could be trusted. But humans have to show their demonstration for trust too. God has to know that he can trust them as well. That's why this test was put into motion. Obviously, Lucifer comes in the form of a serpent and he tempts Eve in order to eat the fruit. She listens to the serpent, who is Satan, the fallen angel, and Adam then eats the fruit, and this causes a gravitational pull of sin. So then everything that is declared as good from God then is corrupt and full of sin. So then this brings exile and consequences. Adam and Eve are exiled from what was known as paradise. They no longer have access to the tree of life. So this is key. They are no longer able to eat from the tree of life, which means they're no longer immortal. So they will die someday. This brings about three different kinds of brokenness into our world. First, you have physical brokenness, which is the fact that humans are no longer immortal. Labor is much harder and is necessary now for survival, whereas in the garden, everything was handed to them. There's social brokenness, which is where man and woman are constantly battling one another for a power struggle to be the best. And then there's spiritual brokenness, which is where Adam and Eve do no longer feel close to God because sin separates us from a holy and righteous God. Then there's Abram, who later becomes Abraham. So as the stories progress, we get to a character who's called Abram. God changes his name to Abraham because he gives him a brand new purpose. So in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, God speaks to Abraham and he says, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make you your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." It's very, very powerful. Abram is obviously the founding father of God's holy people. This is an outstanding promise because God calls a 75-year-old man to leave everything in order to bless him in lineage and number, blessing and renown, which is going to be impacted further on in the story. 25 years go by, nothing has happened. Abraham is now 100 and his wife Sarah, who was once called Sarai, is now 90 years old, but she ends up giving a birth to a son named Isaac. Isaac, later in the story of Genesis, has twins, and the favorite son is Jacob of the twins. God decides to bless Jacob and keep the promise that he made to Abraham through Jacob. And Jacob is a bit of an anti-hero because Jacob is deceitful. He tricks people. He's not honest. He actually exploits his hungry brother at one point, and he deceives his father, who is blind. The biblical characters often you'll see are dual in nature. Although God calls them to do his will and his bidding, they're full of sin and full of error that we see. They're not perfect by any means. God usually calls broken people to do his will. As the story unfolds, Jacob has many children by several different wives, which is what is called polygamy, when you have multiple wives, multiple marriages. This part of the Bible shows a bit of humor, and it's a bit dark in a sense, because even though Jacob is called to do God's work and he's been blessed, and the promise that he kept to Abraham is being sent through Jacob, he's messing up and he's sinning. countless and over again. It just shows that God has to meet people in the midst of their human error and their sin. So then we get to Joseph. Jacob has 12 sons. And out of these sons, his favorite is Joseph. He flaunts his favoritism for Joseph over his brothers, and he makes him a colorful coat, a colorful jacket. And this makes Joseph's brothers very, very angry and upset with him. So they decide to seize him and sell him into slavery into Egypt. They tell their father that Joseph was torn apart by wild animals, which is obviously a lie. Joseph is then isolated from everyone except for God. God does not abandon Joseph though, but he works through this dire situation to bring blessings to Joseph. Then there's obviously some ups and downs in Joseph's life. So Joseph has a roller coaster of events happen. He goes from being the favorite son to being a slave, second in command of a great household to being a prisoner, to an esteemed authority figure among the prisoners. They had great respect for him, to then being abandoned by those that he helped, to then being prominent throughout Egypt, second only to the Pharaoh, who is the king of Egypt. Then Joseph has a triumphant moment. Two main things remain constant in his life. Joseph never abandons God, and God never abandons Joseph. There is a massive famine that takes place while Joseph is in Egypt. His brothers come to Egypt in search of food, and they end up finding Joseph and are terrified. Joseph is not angry with them, but full of mercy. He invites them to Egypt where they can escape the famine of their homeland. Genesis ends with Joseph and his brothers and his father all in Egypt. And this leads us as the audience more confused, because the promised land was actually Canaan. Canaan is what God promised his people, that land would end up becoming Israel, the promised land. But here we see God's people settling in Egypt following Joseph. So this leaves us confused. Was God's plan for them to go to Egypt and that would to become the promised land? Or is the nation of Canaan truly the promised land, but that's just to come later? We have to keep reading and see that the story will indeed unfold here. So Joseph dies, and things end up taking a turn for the worse. The Egyptians do not keep their peace with the Israelites. At first, they saw them as wonderful partners, but now they become slaves to the Egyptians. After hundreds of years of slavery, God sends a deliverer from the lineage of Jacob, and his name is Moses. Moses goes with his brother Aaron to the Pharaoh, and with a warning, they say, let our people go, let the Israelites go, or else God will bring down his wrath. The Bible says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart so that the Pharaoh would not listen, and he said, no, I will not let your people go. Then this is where things start to get interesting. God decides to essentially bring down his wrath and his judgment upon Egypt with plagues. The Pharaoh is overwhelmed, and he says, okay, go ahead, take the Israelites. I don't want them anymore. Take them, because the Israelites and their God, Yahweh, is causing too many problems. So then he sends them away. But then he changes his mind. He's like, no, I'm Pharaoh. I call the shots. We're going back after them, and we're going to re-enslave them. They can't just escape my power. So he commands the Egyptian army to go find the Israelites, and they see them about to cross the Red Sea. God pulls one of the coolest miracles still to this day. He uses Moses to part the Red Sea so that they can cross the Red Sea and go into the promised land. Once they're in the promised land, God calls Moses up to Mount Sinai after rescuing the Israelites. Moses goes up to Mount Sinai, and this is where God gives him the 10 commandments. There are other commandments as well, and they fall under the Torah and the whole TaNaK. TaNaK is the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament. In the TaNaK, there are 613 commandments total, but those come later. But in the Torah, we see the law of Moses and then the 10 commandments given to them. These commandments are meant to bring restoration to the physical, social, and spiritual brokenness that was brought with the fall of mankind after paradise was lost. So there's a quick excursus of the Torah. Torah in Judaism, in the broadest sense, is the substance of divine revelation to Israel, the Jewish people, God's revealed teaching or guidance for humankind. The meaning of Torah is often restricted to signify the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, which is the Old Testament, also called the Law or the Pentateuch in Christianity. These are the books traditionally ascribed to Moses, the recipient of the original revelation from God on Mount Sinai. Jewish, Roman Catholic, and Eastern Orthodox, and even Protestant canons all agree on their order: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So that is the Torah, or the first 5 books of Moses. So first, according to Jesus, we need to remember first 5 important things about the Torah. According to Jesus, the law is ultimately designed for people to love God wholeheartedly and to love their neighbor as themselves, as it says in Matthew chapter 22, verses 35 through 40. Secondly, we need to remember that Jesus points out that the law is a moral stepping stone for the Israelites to meet them in the midst of their messiness, as it says in the Old Testament as well. And third, we need to remember that there are 3 categories of the law that are broken up. You have the moral law, you have the civil law, and the ceremonial law. The moral law is properly how to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. The civil law is how, basically the laws of civilization, right? The laws of how to be a good citizen of Israel. Then the ceremonial laws is when you are entering the holy place, the tabernacle, when you go to worship, when you are praising God, things that you had to follow there. Number 4, humans are created in the image of God. So this means that we are meant to resemble and be like God and represent him in his likeness. So the law helps us to get back on track in right relationship with God and be image bearers of who God is. Number 5, grace comes before the law. The gift of deliverance precedes the obligation or duty to obedience. But we must remember as well that obedience is an outward expression of our love for God. God desires mercy and grace over sacrifice. So let's look at Israel's kings for a moment. The main important ones. The first ever king was Saul, who flourished in the 11th century BCE of Israel. He was the first king, and according to the biblical accounts, found mainly in 1 Samuel, Saul was chosen king by the judge Samuel and by public acclamation. Saul was similar to the charismatic judges who preceded him in the role of governing, and his chief contribution, however, was to defend Israel against its many enemies, especially the Philistines. Saul ended up going down an interesting path, which we will talk about later, a bad path, so to speak, and he was no longer king. But David rises up and David becomes king. So this is the second king of Israel. King David is one of the most prominent figures in the entire Bible. He is known for his bravery, his piety, and his leadership and his boldness, which is considered one of Israel's greatest kings ever. David's story begins with his humble beginnings as a shepherd boy, but he quickly rose to prominence when he defeated Goliath, the giant, with just a sling and a stone. He became a trusted advisor to King Saul, but after Saul's death, David was anointed as the new king of Israel. Solomon, who was David's son, was the third and final king of the unified nation of Israel, succeeding to King David. Well, he succeeded King Saul and then King David. He was the son of David and Bathsheba, which is another story that we will talk about later. The former wife of Uriah the Hittite, whom David had killed to cover his infidelity with Bathsheba while her husband was on the battlefront. Solomon wrote the Song of Solomon, the book of Ecclesiastes, and much of the book of Proverbs. His writing of Ecclesiastes is disputed by some, but Solomon is the only son of David to be king over Israel. Over king in Israel in Jerusalem, as it says in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verses 1 to 12. And many of the descriptions of the author fit Solomon very well. So then we will talk about Rehoboam, who was the son of King Solomon and king of Judah for 17 years, 931 to 913 BC. Solomon had turned away from God, and God told Solomon that he would tear the kingdom from him, yet leave him one tribe. God also promised, for the sake of David, not to tear the kingdom away during Solomon's lifetime, but during that of his son, which we see in 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 9 through 13. Shortly after Rehoboam became king, a rebellion placed the 10 northern tribes under the rule of Jeroboam, and left Rehoboam with his own tribe, which is Judah, and the tribe of Benjamin. So all of these things are very significant through the kingdoms of Israel. It's also important to note this: God is a celestial king and the main one true king of Israel. He was only to rule Israel as a nation, but Israel decided, you know what, God, we're cool with you, but we want to have human kings just like the Gentile nations do. We want to have a governing king that we can submit to. This grieved God's heart. It broke him because he wanted to be the one true king of Israel. But he said, you know what? Okay, if this is what you want, he met them in the middle of it and said, you can have a king of Israel, but it's going to be on my terms. So God granted them permission to have a king, but that wasn't his intended purpose. He wanted to be the one true king of Israel. So then we get to the prophets and the promises of the Bible. God makes covenants with people. We see this with Adam and Eve, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Saul, Solomon, David. We see this with plenty of people. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And no longer shall each one teach his neighbor and each his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. The prophet Jeremiah chapter 31 verses 33 to 34 says this. So we get to prophets. God uses prophets to speak to the nation of Israel, but also to proclaim future events, to proclaim God's future plans. God uses prophets to proclaim his plans for the nation of Israel and even for the world to come in the future. And God speaks to the prophet Jeremiah here to say that he is at work here. He is restoring his covenant, his relationship with the people. So I'm going to read this other prophecy that comes from Psalms chapter 2, verses 1 through 8. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavenly laps, the Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in this wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. So this isn't just a prophecy to some ordinary king to come later in David's lineage. This is talking about the ultimate king, a final king to rule over not just the nation of Israel, but the nation of the entire world. All the nations of the world will fall under him. And we'll learn more about this later. I want to read to you this prophecy that comes from Isaiah. Isaiah verses 52 This comes from Isaiah chapter 52, 13, all the way to Isaiah 53, verse 8. So again, Isaiah 52, verse 13, all the way to 53, verse 8. Behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up. He shall be exalted. As many were astonished at you. His appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of mankind. So shall he sprinkle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. For that which has not been told them they see, and that which they have not heard they understand. Who has believed what he has heard from us? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows, and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray, and we have turned every one to his own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He opened not his mouth by oppression and judgment. He opened not his mouth like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away, and as far for his transgression, who considered that he was cut off of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. And they made his grave with the wicked and with the rich man in his death, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. That is a lot to cover there. This comes from the prophet Isaiah. So this is not talking about any ordinary man. This is not talking about an ordinary servant. This is talking about the one true servant of God, who was the anointed one, the Messiah, who we know as Jesus of Nazareth, who is the Christ. He is God in the flesh, and he fulfilled this prophecy here in Isaiah. And we will talk about that more as we continue the story of Jesus. I hope you all were able to learn something from this. Maybe you knew everything already, or maybe you did learn something new. Either way, thank you so much for tuning in. We're going to be talking about next the story of Jesus and how he is the promised Messiah. He is the Christ. He is the one true servant of God. He is ruler, the one true ruler of Israel. He is the one to fulfill the laws of the Old Testament. And he is God in the flesh. He is God's one and only begotten Son, and he's the firstborn among many brothers and sisters that are to come in God's adopted family. We will talk about this in the next video. Until then, I hope you all got something out of this. I love you. If there's any way I can be praying for you, please let me know down in the comments. God bless you. May he keep you, watch over you and your families. Shalom, shalom. Peace be with you.